Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I'm Frances Fisher. I have the honor of chairing the board here at Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens, and it is a pleasure to welcome you for Discovering Creativity, American Art Masters, and our conversation tonight in collaboration with Heather James Fine Art and the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'd like to begin by thanking our art committee chairs and board members, David Miller and Karen Lamb, and also our dynamic executive director, Margaret Horgan, who leads our team here. I'm joined tonight by our special guest, Chip Tom, who is the creator of the exhibition and curator for Heather James, and Valerie Balint, director of the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program, which we refer to as HAHS. And tonight we hope to have an open dialogue with you. We are in Ann and Ralph Norton's living room, and I can think of nothing she would have loved better than to be having this conversation. So Margaret has an extra microphone, and we are videoing so we can share tonight's discussion on our platforms between Heather James and the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program. So please feel free to raise your hand and share your thoughts or comments as we progress through our conversation. I wanted to open with two quotes from Ann Norton that capture the essence, I think, of her work and legacy here. The first is, she said, "I hope visitors from near and afar will find this sculpture nature garden a deep refreshing." And I think that's so telling of her inspiration and wishes for her property to be enjoyed as a natural sanctuary and an oasis here. And the second quote is, "Art is made to be beautiful and last." And that is indeed very reflective of the exhibition that we're going to be talking about tonight. Hi, Karen. Hello, Rick. Glad you're here. My first question is going to be for Chip. Chip, can you tell us what your favorite painting in this exhibition or work is? You've conceived of this. You have thought about how it would be carefully curated alongside Ann Norton's work. Share with us some of your inspiration and what your favorite one is.
Okay, thank you, Frances. I'm looking forward to answering your question, but I also wanted to say my gratitude and thanks for you, for Karen, for Mark, Sarah, everyone that's just been here. David, yes, it's just been magical too. This is our second time partnering, and it just keeps getting better and better. And you all are so professional and hospitable, and it's just been such an honor and a pleasure to be part of it. So I wanted to say that first, because I really have a very special place in my heart for you all. So.
And we do for you.
Okay, thanks. There's a mutual love fest here. In picking out my favorite, one of my favorites, let's put it that way, because I want to mention two, but I'll talk about one fully. It's, you're not supposed to have a favorite child, so I'm technically not supposed to have a favorite, but of course I do. There are pieces that really touch me in so many more ways than just aesthetically, how beautiful it is, how famous the artist is. And so the two, I will mention the two that are favorites of mine. And one is right behind you, Frances. It's the painting of Cottonwood Tree in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Georgia O'Keeffe. Can everyone see that one? It's really special to me too because it's not only is aesthetically beautiful, but and I'll get into more about why I selected this piece of all the beautiful Georgia O'Keeffes there are. This one is special for the theme of the exhibition, and that is at Georgia O'Keeffe's studio. She would look outside of her window and there is this beautiful cottonwood tree, and it would greet her every day when she went into the studio. And I wanted to create as many of these links with the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden, of course, and HAHS, and show everyone in the audience of what she would see, not this particular tree, and she painted it in different seasons, but I wanted to create this feeling where you could be standing in front of, in her studio, looking out at the cottonwood tree. So it's beautiful, but it also has special meanings. And then the one that I have to talk about that really is my favorite is the portrait of Nan by Grant Wood. And again, it's a beautiful painting. It's historically important, but the story is incredible. And a lot of times we go to museums and we see an object in isolation, or the curators do a great job of creating a dialogue between pieces. But then sometimes you miss the inspirations and things that were really important to the artists when they were creating these works. And so that's why I wanted to share the story of Grant Wood creating this portrait of Nan. So everyone knows, I think it's, well, for me, growing up and studying art history, one of the most important, most famous paintings of the 20th, American paintings of the 20th century has to be American Gothic, which Grant Wood exhibited at the Art Institute in Chicago. And it was instantly a success. I mean, everyone was just talking about it and was in awe of it. And the thing is that, there's a reproduction on the didactic panel at the back of the room. But everyone wanted to know who were the subjects in the painting. And there was all this speculation that this was a husband and his younger wife, and who were, or is it the farmer and his daughter? And so it turns out that Grant Wood, as many artists do, hire or ask sitters to be people who are in the sphere of this world. And so the gentleman is his dentist, and the woman is his sister. So, I mean, and often in art history, you'll find that the artist would ask friends, Andrew Wyeth, and the people that were local. But they've now taken on Christina's World, for example. They've taken on a life of their own, and that's the same thing that happened in American Gothic. These people didn't know who they were, so they were making up all these stories. So this was luckily pre-social media, so information disseminated a little slower than it does now. But Nan, Grant Wood's sister, got a lot of negative attention because either story, if she's the younger wife of an older gentleman, you know, what's going on with that, because it wasn't that common back then. And then if someone knew a little bit about the story, they also knew that the dentist was married, so then there's that element of it. And if she's the daughter, you know, why does she have such a dour, why are, you know, her expression so sad and downturned. So after all this negativity came out, Grant Wood said to Nan, Grant Wood lived with his mother and his sister for his whole life. They were incredibly close, and so he felt that he owed his sister something, an apology for all the negativity that she got from American Gothic. So he said to her, I want to paint you in a beautiful, the way I see you, in this beautiful portrait where you're wearing this beautiful dress, and it'll be, again, my apology to you for this. So he put so much love into this. This is the only painting that he didn't sell his entire career. After American Gothic, his career just took off. And so unfortunately passed away at a young age, and so he only created about 30 more major paintings after American Gothic, and this was the only one that he refused to sell it because it meant so much to him. And also, even as he was getting more successful, they bought other homes, and he designed the living room in the house that they ended up living in, and placed it over the fireplace in a location similar. I'm going to let Valerie talk a little bit because I've never been to this Grantwood house, and so this is exciting for me to have all these stories and have someone who's actually been there. But I wanted to recreate this where it would be similarly in the prominent place in the home. And there's so many stories I could tell, but I want to share tonight. But the polka dotted dress has a story, the chicken, that little chick that she has. I mean, I could talk for hours just about this one painting, and that's why it's my favorite child.
It's our centerpiece of the
Yes,
exhibition.
exactly.
Thank you, Jim. Valerie, we know that you write and speak often about how paintings provide touchstones back to the places where they were made. So I'd like to know more about what you mean by that, and are there specific works in the show that particularly demonstrate that connection for you?
Thanks, Frances. And can you all hear me? You can't? Okay. So I want to also start with my thanks. It's been a real joy for HAHS to be involved in this project, and this show is great. And for me, shows the sort of breadth, I think, and depth of art in this country, and very rarely do you get to see it outside of a major museum in one space, in a domestic space. This is a domestic space we're in. And the large majority of work is shown in a domestic space. And so in dialogue with each other. And when I mean that works themselves are touchstones back to where they were made, I think it starts with a really basic premise. Once we separate it out from the artist, we often forget it was made through labor and in a place by a person with a wealth of experience, right? We are all product of experience and the places in which we have that experience. And we bring them to everything we do in our life in conscious and unconscious ways. And I think often we look at a painting, we see the final painting, there are formal elements of a painting, we analyze a painting relative to its attractiveness to us, and whether it resonates with us. But as Chip has started to allude to, behind every painting are myriad stories, which often trace right back to the place. And so, of course, the most direct example of that is the Abacute work that is by O'Keeffe. Because that is a landscape. Georgia O'Keeffe had many lives. She is a painter of many subjects, including cityscapes, New York images, where she lived with her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, the great gallerist and photographer. But it is that landscape that when you say Georgia, because she's like Madonna and Cher in our world, you can't just say Grant. People be like, Grant who? But you can just say Georgia, okay? And so it's that work. Those are the things she looked at every day, which means she became intimately in communion with it, okay? Because in the same way that behind, and I'll get to her later, Nan, but this beautiful small work, which is July, basically in the environment that Grant Wood spent his entire adult life painting in. And if you have ever gone to this part of the country, this is what it looks like today. And the potency of that place was not just, he's not capturing just a place, he's capturing the place that he's with every single day. One of the other favorites for me is perhaps a little less bombastic work, which is called Bright Sun, which is around the corner, and it's by Charles Birchfield. So the small work that we have here, and there are two works, and they relate directly to place. Very rarely do you save a childhood home of an artist. And Charles Birchfield's childhood home is saved in Salem, Ohio. And he went on to have a series of other homes. But the fact is that the entire sort of germination of this talent and the way he looked at the world and at place was formed as a young man in that place. And so around the corner is a work that he calls Bright Sun, where he actually has a notation on it, which is also a way back of understanding how artists do their work. It is his neighborhood. That's his neighborhood. It's called Bright Sun, but you can go and you can look and see like, well, that's his neighborhood. But what he's doing in that work, the way he approaches that work, he continues to come back to his entire career. But I think what's most important to know about that work is it was done at the tender age of 23 years old. And then over in the same gallery is a work also done right before he's moving to Buffalo. And it is, again, very tied to this place. There is a Mennonite wagon in this image. It is this part of the Midwest. And he keeps that in him his entire career. And I could go on. Every single work in this room an argument can be made for the place where not only people lived in a grand sense, but in terms of also the things that they were surrounded with every day, and often have to do with the things also happening in their life, which we don't often talk about when we put something up on a museum wall or a gallery wall. And that's really the beauty of what Chip has done here. He's done storytelling. And to me, we're all in a place that is also about storytelling and the power of being in a place where you are coming into that storytelling. But paintings can do that also if you're kind of looking hard enough. So those are just a couple. I could go like Chip. We could be here for the entire evening discussing one by one in a sort of encyclopedia kind of way. But Charles Birchfield is a very, very, very successful painter by the end of his life. And this is the origin. The two works here are those early years that relate directly to the place where he grew up and formed as an artist, but also as a human being. And that's what I mean when I talk about how paintings become this touchstone back to that.
Thank you. And Valerie, we know that the HAHS program has been expanding and now consists of 61 sites across the country. We have been so delighted and honored to be a part of that, and we celebrate your book, which we have available for everyone tonight. Valerie has generously signed the book, and it has a gorgeous chapter about Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens in it. So my next question is, why is it so important or critical to preserve these sites? And potent resources for understanding the creatives and their artworks. And can you define how you feel that occurs and what types of resources a site can be for that kind of discovery?
Yes, so I just talked about how the painting can be a touchstone to the place, and the converse is true, and often incredibly potently. Now, at the core, it's because where the stuff was made, right? Like it's where the thing happened, right? But when I mean the thing, I mean the thing in terms of the physical labor. I mean the thing in terms of the mental labor. And I mean the thing in terms of what life does to people who are also living creative practice. And so when you come to a site, and the Norton site is a perfect way to talk about this concept, which is to say you have the arc of a full human being at this site, right? When you see an exhibition, often it's a sliver of a type, of a period, of a type of work. You know, that's what curators need to do. We're trying to draw attention to certain things. Is that when you come to a site, you are immersed in a life, not just a practice. The practice is part of the life. And so we see, I love this sculpture right behind this gentleman. Well, then we can go to the studio and we can see the tools and we can begin to understand how things are made. That things are made through great labor, but we also can begin to understand how artists, we silo artists and say, okay, they're a painter, they're a sculptor, they're this or that, but they're living creatively every single day that they're on the planet. And when you come here and you look at the arc of where then Ann Norton sought to become big scale, right? Some of the works in the you see the connectivity, but then you go outside and it's a different animal. Yet also you put an imprint on the way that you collect objects, arrange objects, or the plants outside, because artists want to stretch themselves in terms of how they express creatively. And the way in which they do that, because when you come to HAHS sites, you don't always get to see the great work, but usually great work's in a museum. You get to see the preparatory works, of which Ann Norton has a great deal, and you get to see experimentation and exploration. And why that's important to me is because it reminds us that that lies in all of us, okay? That we tend to see the best and the perfection. And when we come to sites like this, we bring ourselves. Anybody that comes into this space or the studio or the garden, you bring you to that space, right? And you react to that space with her as an artist, but also as a human being. But there are other ways too that are more direct. N.C. Wyeth, great illustrator of books. You go to N.C. Wyeth's home and you see all the props that are used in these paintings. You go to Charles Demas' home in Lancaster and you see the things he could see out his window that he was depicting from his upper story window because he had diabetes and would have to go convalesce, and he would need to draw what he could see. And then you have the beautiful ability with an Andrew Wyeth and an N.C. Wyeth to see a multi-generational scope by going to the places. Andrew Wyeth is he's one of the most famous artists of this century, okay, and commercially successful. He had two places he went, Maine and Chadds Ford. And the intimacy of knowing those places and being in those places, if you love the work, you just get the work. You just understand what he was tapping into in a way I would argue is incredibly singular. And I would argue happens here too. The forms sometimes that Ann uses are very informed by what it means to be in Florida. As someone who comes from the Northeast, it's different, right? The light is different, the air is different, the impulses are different, and that all reflects. And so to understand that, to go back to the origin where the thing was made offers, I think, a particularly unique experience, and I would also argue a gateway into understanding the artist in a multifaceted way, as a total human person, and a person who develops over time, both as a person and an artist.
I think you just captured what we have been striving for, which is happening through our Protecting a Legacy campaign. And just so proud that we've been able to revitalize this property, not just to be community and visitor serving, but to preserve the Norton House. the original artist studio, and the gardens, all the monumental sculptures. There have been some great milestones in the last several years here in terms of our preservation efforts, and it just only furthers our ability to tell that full story of the artist in her life.
Which is the story I think lots of people want to hear.
Right?
That's the story. It's a richness to that I think taps into something pretty visceral, whether you're an art aficionado or not.
Exactly. Chip, this is a loaded question. Why is it particularly powerful that an exhibition takes place at a site like Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens? And clearly you feel this way, having conceived the exhibition.
This was really a very special project. And this, as we had mentioned before, was now the second time that I've had the honor of curating a show here. And for me, it's been this incredible learning journey. And as I get to know and Valerie as a curator will know too, that when you first work in a space, it's the most difficult, because I'm coming from California. I hadn't had the opportunity to physically come and see the space. I've seen lots of photographs and floor plans and ceiling heights and everything that one would think you would need when you design an exhibition. And then you get to the actual space and it's just a working plan, and everything is fluid. So I was very proud of our partnership and what we did with the first exhibition, but this one really meant so much more to me now, because I know you and I also know the space, and I really understand now what the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden is trying to do and what you've been able to do in the for the public. And so coming up with this idea, I had known about HAHS. I've been to several of the HAHS sites and have always enjoyed them. They're very different. Each one is very, very different. And I highly recommend, if you have a chance, to get the book and then look, if you're going to be in a certain city, to look to see if there's a HAHS house there, because it'll be really worth the visit. But as I delved deeper and deeper into HAHS and Ann Norton's participation in HAHS, I was just fascinated, because art people are all about learning. This is just, our life is, and what we like to share is continual learning and then sharing. And so I loved getting into the weeds with the artists in that HAHS program. And I was like, this is an incredible opportunity to share that with everyone. Just a little window. And I even took the title of the show is Discovering Creativity. The byline for HAHS is Witnessing Creativity. But that is exactly the way I thought of this. We're seeing a slice, we're witnessing or discovering a slice of the artist and the artwork through the HAHS and the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden in a way that if you go to another museum, you won't have that learning experience. And how exciting is that, to learn something new? Everyone knows about American Gothic, and yet this is a little new slice of Grant Wood that you're all experiencing that other people won't have that opportunity.
Well, and you have taken such a humanistic approach in your curation of both of these exhibitions. We really do have a much deeper perspective of the artist, and certainly from all of our correspondence in the archives here, we know that is something that Ann Norton greatly valued.
If I may just say one more thing, Frances, because this was really important in my curating the show. I wanted Ann Norton. Ann Norton is here and Ralph are here, but I wanted Ann's work here in the show in a different way. And you can go out to the sculpture, you can see all her beautiful pieces in the Sculpture Garden, you can go to the studio, but I wanted to show how she's such a powerhouse among this other group of artists. I love the combination of Ann's work with Georgia O'Keeffe's painting. I just got goosebumps when I saw this and wanted to share this dialogue that they have with each other. And so I'm really proud of the Ann Norton room, Gallery 4,
Yes.
as part of this. Section.
Well, you've blended Ann's work magnificently, and we thank you for that. It's been both heartwarming and exciting for this organization to be among these great American masters. Valerie, I want to close with a question for you, and then we'll talk a little bit with our guests. I think you know better than anyone how preserved sites represent the intersection of personal biography and artistic practice. And you touched on that. What are the items that artists might need around them in their space, and what drives the will behind their work?
So it's different for everyone, and Chip has alluded to that. And some things are very present. I think we have two direct carvers. We have Ann here as a direct carver, her work, and then we have Chaim Gross as a direct carver. And so if you were to go to their respective studios, let's say we could do a Star Trek situation and go to Chaim Gross's studio right after this. There are synergies, there are tons of tools, but Chaim Gross was an active collector of African art. He traveled to Africa. He also used often his own wife and children as muse. So right there's the intersection. So some people need very cluttered studios and are avid collectors themselves, exchange works with other artists. And then you have those who want to live in a more Spartan environment. Donald Judd is an example of this. And sometimes those things make sense, and sometimes they're not what you would expect. So I will use this. The great populist painter Thomas Hart Benton taught Jackson Pollock, a man of the people who lived in a Gilded Age manse, okay, in one of the grandest homes in HAHS. And what he also needed around him, although he was a muralist painter, was he worked in 3 dimensions. He actually has maquettes that you go and you see in the studio. He would build like models of work that in the end would be really flat. Some people need music in their studio. So when you go to these studios, you see the working tools, certainly, but you see the inspiration that they need in their home and the things they're living with all the time. And that no one exists in a vacuum. And I love, so for 5 years, I worked at the home of Susie Frelinghuysen and George L.K. Morris. And George L.K. Morris's work is behind us. And they had a home in Paris, a home in New York, and a great summer retreat that they created in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. And behind me is a work called Bagatelle. And Chip has done a wonderful label about Beethoven and about the formal elements that other cubists were using and how they would often bring music and the whole, this is called a tondo, what it means to have like an oval in work. But now I'm going to tell you the intersection of life. Susie Frelinghuysen, this was done basically within the first few years of his marriage to Susie Frelinghuysen, who was an opera singer. And music permeates their house. And she loved to use musical sheet music in her own composition. Certainly she wasn't the only one to do so. But when I look at this work, I'm like, well, there's Susie creeping in, and there's the work of a newlywed, and there's life infiltrating art in a very, very personal way. And those are, I think, the things that I could pick out something everywhere, and certainly the Nan wood is a great example of this, in that, and I think this is what this site offers and every site offers. It's the layering. It's the, Chip has only touched upon some aspects of this narrative relative to this work. And so this is a deeply personal painting that hung in another home that he created when he got famous, that is actually preserved and is privately owned. I hope someday it will be open for all of you. I've had the privilege to go there. And this hung, and historically. And this was an incredibly important person in his life, but he's not really known for a lot of portraits beyond American Gothic. This is a person who's known much more for landscape painting. And I think when you talk about the intersection of life, and I also say the integration of life and art, I think it's very present here. Artists are just living their life, and they have what we call an artful life practice, and it's everywhere, and it creeps in everywhere. And certainly this painting, which has pride of place in the exhibition, is a great example of it. But there are Easter eggs in basically every painting, if we're looking for them and know where to look. And so I think that, but to understand those connections, we often have to get back to the place of origin and inhabit it and be in it and understand that there are commonalities, certainly, but every artist, what inspires them, what they need to have around them to work and be productive is different. They have their own personal trials and tribulations of life, and those things impact the work. And certainly that is incredibly potent at this site because of the last great artistic project that Ann Norton gave to this community as she was struggling with the own reality of her life, right? I always include Ann Norton in every lecture I give, and that's true. Because that is, you're welcome, Frances. But it's because it encapsulates, for me, that intersection of life and art, and the necessity of art in life. Whether you be a practicing artist like Ann Norton, or whether you are just like a human being in the world. That's a heavy, heavy statement, but I believe that. I really believe that.
Well, I think you have both so beautifully captured what the life of an artist and historic places do to exemplify the power of place and the very fabric of our American cultural heritage reflected here tonight. And I want to ask if we have some questions or thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. This is a question for Chip. Today, believe it or not, is 1 year and 2 months that I became widowed. And you were speaking about the portrait here. For me, the portrait right behind you is where I see myself. And as many of us know, when we look at a piece of art, it becomes very personal. When I look at the piece behind you, I see myself, the lonely widow, and nobody cares about me anymore. You know, everybody thinks I'm after their husband. Give me a break. Can you just believe I'm alive? Just say, hey, I'm glad you're alive. Is there anything I can do for you? But you spoke on this painting, and as I look at it, her dress looks quite modern, but yet she's got that despair look on her face, that sadness. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on how this portrait, just caught your attention, please? Thank you.
Sure, and first of all, let me start by saying I'm so sorry for your loss. I've gone through a lot of loss also, and it's really hard, and being around people and talking, I think, would certainly help me, and I'm glad you're here tonight. tonight with us.
Thank you.
I, first of all, let me start by saying I'm so sorry for your loss. I've gone through a lot of loss also, and it's really hard, and being around people and talking, I think, would certainly help me, and I'm glad you're here tonight with us.
Thank you.
when I first, I'm from Chicago originally, and so as a young boy, I saw American Gothic at the Art Institute, and I actually had been to Cedar Rapids, where Grant Wood lived, and several times. There's a Cedar Rapids Museum of Art that, similar to some of the HAHS locations, it's in Cedar Rapids, it's in his hometown, but it's not a museum that could afford to buy the major Grant Woods. So they have early Grant Woods, such as the painting that's over there. And the print actually comes from a collector that's from Cedar Rapids. And he had a studio mate named Marvin Cohen, who is much less known artist, but I think also equally, I don't know if you know his work, really important artist. So I preface all this by saying that I have a personal connection to Grant Wood's work from an early age. So when I saw this painting, I actually couldn't believe it, because in my research and trying to find the best works for the exhibition, I was getting smaller works that are, as Valerie said, have their own story and equally as important, but not necessarily a prime period of Grant Wood's works. I think I mentioned earlier that he did 30 major works after American Gothic, and this is the only one that's not in a museum, that's in private hands. So it's not like I could easily look up the other museums and ask if I could borrow one of those, but to actually have this one be available to the show was incredible.
Indeed.
I did this little dance, to be honest with you, because I was like so excited that I could put this piece into the exhibition. So as Valerie said, he wasn't known for portraiture, and they did have a hard life. I mean, it wasn't fun games. It wasn't the glamorous life of a lot of the other artists, also living in a bigger city and things like that. So I think it's somber, but I don't think she's like, not as
Austere.
yes, thank you, Francis, as American Gothic. And he wanted to make her pretty, and actually I will, because you mentioned the dress. So he had envisioned her in a really beautiful dress when he wanted to paint her portrait. So he also had the idea that he wanted her in a polka dot dress. So he said to his sister, so can you put on a polka dot dress so I can paint you? And she's like, we're in the middle of Cedar Rapids, you know, I mean, it's like, where am I going to get a fashionable polka dot dress? So he said, well, do you have a sheet? And so she gave him a sheet. He used a closed can and painted it with the lid and made the polka dots and then handed it back to her and asked her to make a dress out of it.
That's a great story.
I mean, that to me is also a fantastic example of the multiple ways of expression and sort of just technical ability that many of these artists have, including Ann Norton, but certainly Grant Wood. Grant Wood was, before he ever became a painter, he was a decorative arts, created decorative arts objects, and very, very good ones. And a fantastic stained glass window in Cedar Rapids, if you ever, where you learned how to do that in France. So the lives of these artists are incredibly complex. I will also, you know, this is a very formal portrait, and the way in which that composition is harkens back to centuries of, you know, princely portraits, right? And yet then with something in the hand, but then we bring it down to a very modernist moment through that choice. She is a woman of that moment. I just would feel remiss having you shared what your response, I believe, to the Homer work.
Yes.
So this is also the power of art, and you have just become a fantastic illustration of it, despite the reason for which that is the case. This period of work by Homer represents a very particular moment in the overarching, it was a very long career, Homer. This is representative of the works that are happening post-Civil War. And so the grief is real. And that is something that yes, she's solitary in a field. I would also argue that that collective grief, personal upendedness, was what he was trying to capture in things from this period as a collective conscience of the country. And you, without knowing anything about that, he poured that into the painting, the way people pour love and emotion into like bread or stew, right? And I think that's also part of it. You didn't know that, and I'm telling you that this is a painting about grief, actually,
Yes.
right? And you can feel that, right? But it isn't just the grief of the subject. Homer is expressing a collective national grief, okay? And that's, and in some ways more powerfully done through that subject, right, than maybe like a narrative that you go, oh, that's from the post-Civil War period. So your ability to tap into that and feel connected to that is in many ways what art can offer if we just respond to the innate things that we respond to instead of worrying about what the painting means or what it's about, right? That's right there is a connection you had that Chip or I could go and teach you a bunch about this painting, about Homer, but that connection is what artists are, that's what the art is really about. So thank you for sharing that, you know, incredibly personal thing that you're going through yourself, and the ability for you to tap into something in this piece that no one had to write a label about for you.
Thank you. Well, like I said, when any one of us look at a piece of work, the way I see it is not the way the person next to me to my right or left sees it. And I just wanted to bring that up because when I look at this painting, this portrait, I see a very sad woman, but I see someone, and if I remember correctly, she was Grant Wood's sister, and he wanted to do something to make her feel important, make her feel like she was worth something, and that's why I reached out on this. Thank you very much.
So, thank you for the question, and
You're
I just want
welcome.
to add real quickly that Valerie and I had a chance yesterday to talk just briefly about things, but one thing that we both mentioned is for the artists and for curators, when we present works to the public, to the audience, if some piece, if the exhibition or a piece in the exhibition touches someone, we're successful. And we just talked about that yet last night, and so thank you for...
I catch you on the back.
Yeah.
We have a question right here.
I actually have another question for Chris, and I think you'll be probably answering this as well. Could you talk a little bit about the craft of curating? You had such a richness of pieces. How did you combine a Wood, a Homer, and a Mitten in the same room? Different dialogue going in that room, and that room. It's important for us to understand that process, the design process that happens. Could you touch on that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question. And I will, as Valerie knows, there are lots of practical and theoretical. I'm going to say it this way, though. Instead of describing it in a work type environment, I'm going to say it this way, that I was an artist from a very young age, and I spent a lot of time making art and studying art history, and in the end I decided that that wasn't going to be my lifetime career, that I could see where my artwork stood in comparison to a lot of other artists. why I was so attracted to curating is, to me, I'm making a piece of art. This exhibition, to me, in my heart, is a piece of art that I want to share with everyone. And so the story, I think it's just like with cooking, with a lot of things that, you know, the more love you put into it, the more that will come out of it. And so I take these other artists' works as a brush stroke. So I'm painting for you by using these other artists as my brush strokes. So that's a heartfelt way of kind of answering your questions. I get really excited about the dialogue. That the storytelling is also really important. So when I create this room as opposed to that room, yes, there are time frame things that I take in when pieces were made. There are two things that I wanted to just briefly mention that I learned from this exhibition, besides so much about HAHS and Ann Norton, but there's so many things I want to say. I actually like when I come in to curate, it's not carte blanche. It's not this white cube where there are like no doors and windows. It's not complete freedom of pick whatever topic that you want to curate. I actually like it when I have these parameters that I have to work with, not around, but with. And having it in a domestic space is quite different than a white cube. Having the location, having the artist, learning about HAHS. I get so much out of learning, and then I want to share that with everyone. So having the ability to curate this show with HAHS and Norton as such a big part of HAHS was a real privilege to me because I learned so much. But I wanted to tell this story. There's geographical elements that I'm bringing in. There's time periods I'm bringing in. I love the fact that there are two things that I was mentioning earlier that I learned. I knew about throughout American art history, but this show also really, to me, makes a huge example of that, and that is how much influence European art had on these American masters. I mean, there's so many artists in the show that either went, like Grant Wood, we're talking, he went to live in Europe, and he brought back all of that. So that was one big element, how much they did. Obviously the Morrises, there's just so many examples, but how much influence Europe had, and then we Americanized it. We made it our own language, which I think was fascinating. The other thing is how many artists, including Ann Norton, were in awe of the American West landscape, from Thomas Moran. Again, so many, Donald Judd, just so many were just, and we all are too, awestruck with the natural beauty that we have in this country, and then how much that brought in. So I hope that gave you a little window in what it was.
Brushstrokes is a wonderful way to describe it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Alex?
Thank you, and thank you all for everything tonight. As you said before, we can't time travel. We can't freeze time. We can't freeze a building site or a piece of artwork. So things have to evolve, and we sort of want to let them evolve. So one of the things that I think is sort of neat about this whole thing here tonight is, now all of these artworks are part of the story of this site, and each one of these artworks has its story, is part of, they both dialogue with each other, and they dialogue with how those things evolve. So if you could maybe in more of a macro sense, talk about why that's important to let things evolve and why it's good to have exhibits like this. Thank you.
I think, so I'll talk about this in terms of, I think we've touched upon it a bit, is that whether you're curating or whether we talk about the houses themselves as maybe like an Uber exhibit, none of these things matter, and I say this as a great lover of objects and architecture. they need to be activated. What we're talking about is activation, right? And ties to each other, to bigger ideas, and to contemporary relevance. Because if something does not relate to sort of every object in every building is of its time, and every artist of their time. I think what is important to understand, which is sort of getting around it, but the minute that we move to another era, we historicize it, right? It's historicized. But Ann Norton was a contemporary artist in her own time. This building was a master of contemporary architecture in the time that it was built, right? And so the connectivity of that idea of the possible, and this is something I keep sort of thinking about a lot. What does art represent at its most basic level? What do the places where these artists live and work represent at the most basic level, and their connectivity to each other in very direct or indirect ways? Like, this painting for me talks, the Benton talks to the NCY, and just like, that's my own dialogue I'm having, okay? Other things can talk to each other in very direct ways, and that's part of curating, is trying to make those connections, but honestly offer connections for you to make yourself that we don't prescribe. It's a delicate balance, and I would argue a good show is when it achieves that balance. But what the whole enterprise represents as a continuum, right? Because we can't go back and live the lives they were living, right? We can't, and we have in some ways hermetically sealed it in some ways, right? Anne would have been moving stuff around the studio all the time, or, right? Is that they represent the continuous aspect of people's basic human need to express, no matter what, okay? Even before language, okay? And every single one of these artists, especially these artists, pushed the idea of what is possible to represent, what is possible to approach as a legitimate subject for a painting. They stretched ideas about materiality. And when we talk about these sites, they're also often, as is done here at the Norton Garden, the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. Francis has to continue to school me on that. Is that they are places for contemporary inspiration, right? And that can be very direct in terms of having children here being inspired, contemporary artists to be here to be inspired, to have events by which we are ignited and inspired. But we become a part of the dialogue. I think the most important thing is, without people to activate a show, without people to walk through and make connectivity about the connectivity that existed between these people and places, we can preserve, and preservation for the idea of preserving accomplishment as a species is important in its own, the way we do literature, really any achievement. But why does it sustain? Because all of these things, again, represent what at one time was the germination of the idea of the advancement of the possible and the will to make it manifest in the tangible. And that's why they matter to me today, and the connective threads between these incredibly disparate artists who have connections, but they're their own people and have very strong ideas about sometimes each other's work, honestly. And so for me, that's why those dialogues continue to be meaningful, whether it be between a painting, a HAHS site, or us in an individual site. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And I just want to express our heartfelt gratitude to Valerie and to Chip, and also to Brett Kling, who is Director of Sales and been a great collaborator the last 2 seasons from Heather James. It is just an honor, a pleasure. We hope to see you back here again, and I thank everyone for being a part of our conversation tonight. I hope you take a piece of Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens and inspiration with you. Just a quick plug, there will be a final jazz concert coming up March 10th. Margaret?
Mickey Kidd is a week from Sunday. And I just also wanted to thank you all for coming and for being such great ambassadors for Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. This exhibition is up for just a few more weeks until March 17th, so please encourage your friends to come and see, and you can share what you learned tonight, which makes the experience even more meaningful, I think, for people when they come to view the exhibition. Yes, we have another jazz concert, we'll have another exhibition opening.
Artist in Residence program kicking off in March, 10th anniversary of our Gardens Conservancy, which is our wonderful stewardship circle here that I know quite a few of you are part of, and so that'll be March 20th. And we have one more conservation conversation, do we?
Two more.
Two more.
Yeah, CJ is our master gardener in residence, is having her lecture a week from tomorrow, CJ McCartney, and I wouldn't miss that one. If you've ever heard CJ speak, she does a beautiful job, and she helped to design, along with Sarah Bennett's, our pollinator garden, and she's a pretty incredible speaker, so I encourage you to come to that.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We wish you a wonderful rest of your evening.